but there are two things there. There's the issue of whether you have free will to drop the cannonball, and then there's the certainty of what will happen afterwards. Now, I talk about certainty of what will happen given a particular event as being the opposite of free will. That if we know that cannonballs falling on feet and hands letting go of cannonballs are all, are definitely going to happen, then that's sort of telling us we don't have free will. Free will is really, we need free will to say that the future is open and there's unpredictability.
I wouldn't bother to apply my choice to predicting the eligible. Suppose I was your enemy, I would apply my choice to dropping the cannonball on your foot. So that's an area I bother with and an area I don't.
So yes, so for you, the notion of whether you actually made that choice freely, whether you had any say in the matter of whether you were going to drop the cannonball or not, is not relevant. You feel you had the free choice of being able to do that, and that's giving you your free will. That's your point. So that's my point. That yes, so you feel you have free will. My point is that that is just an illusion, because the neurons in your brain, the muscle action, the choices that you made to release the cannonball are subject to the laws of physics themselves. Yes?
You're saying that because things aren't predictable, we have free will, or we can't use for the illusion of free will. But choice is about being able to predict things. So your free will happens without being able to choose, which for me isn't free will.
You are able to, you're right,
How
yes.
do you choose without predictability? Good choice is about being able to predict two alternative courses and choose between them.
Yes, so having free will to choose between outcome A or B, you feel as though you could have chosen A or you could have chosen B.
And outcome A and B would predictably occur, because that's what choice is about, is being able to know what B is going to happen. And you're saying we don't have predictability.
Well, if you know in advance that A or B is going to happen, you don't have a freedom in choosing one or the other.
Yeah, I don't think we do, but I don't think you make space for free will by giving up predictability, because you push out choice.
I'd have to think that one through. My brain is as fuddled as yours is. Yes?
I'm an engineer, and we deal a bit regularly with probabilities. And the other thing is that when we make a measurement, we have to state the tolerances.
Yes.
Can you comment on that?
Yes, well, tolerances really is exactly this idea of predicting the initial conditions. What you're saying is you need to know to specify the properties of whatever it is you're building or the machine that you're working on to some level of accuracy such that it encompasses all potential future outcomes. So tolerance says that if I run this machine in this temperature range for this length of time, subject to these other constraints of vibrations, it's going to behave itself and it's going to do its job. So, probably. Yes, no, of course, yeah, absolutely. But yes, the point is that you can never put in a tolerance that's, that would get rid of the uncertainty entirely. Because that's what you would need if you wanted to predict the outcome of something indefinitely into the future. There will always be a point where it'll break down, it'll start behaving not the way you expected it to. Not because the laws of physics were somehow not determined or fuzzy, but because you could not predict with certainty how these predetermined laws were going to evolve. Yes?
Did you deliberately avoid to explain the difference in these patterns to the single atom scatters through the slots when you turned the camera off?
Yes.
The camera that was observing.
I yes, I deliberately did it just for dramatic effect.
So what did happen then? Why were there only 2 scatter bands on the plate when you had the camera on, and then you came back to the interference bands when you turned the camera off?
Yep.
So the atoms must have known that you had a camera on.
Yes. Yes. Now,
Elucidate a good problem.
okay. The way we understand it is that by the act of measurement, you force a quantum system to make a choice. So it can be doing 2 things at once, but you never observe it doing 2 things at once. By the act of measurement, by looking at it, you're interacting with it, and you make it do one thing or the other. So when you're not observing it, this is the observation. This is where we're looking at it. We're forcing the wavy, atom going as a wave somehow going through both slits to make up its mind where it's going to be. And
But the atoms don't know whether the camera's on or off.
They don't know whether it's on or off, but they are that quantum entity is affected when you look at it. And the camera is looking at it. The camera is, by looking at something, you have to fire a photon, bounce off a photon off of it or something, and record its position. So here, you're not messing with the quantum weirdness and allowing them to interfere. Here's where you measure, here's where you force it to make up its mind, by which time it's already given rise to interference pattern, so it can arrive somewhere. But when I'm looking, as it's coming through, I'm forcing it to either be there or there. By the act of observation, I'm observing it before it's had a chance.
But the atom doesn't know that.
Well, hey, look, take it up with the atom. Thank you. Now you understand. Niels Bohr said, if you're not astonished by quantum mechanics, you haven't understood it. You still have now understood quantum mechanics, which is why you're astonished and why, this is why we shut up and calculate, because it just, it's what? How can the atom know and be aware of what you're up to? And there are even experiments which are called quantum eraser, delayed choice experiments, where you can not allow it to go through 2 slits, but allow it to go through 2 arms of what's called an interferometer, which are sort of very far apart. And until you look, each atom is going both ways. And you can look to see which one it's in, or have a detector measure to see it's either there or there. But before it gets to the point where the 2 recombine again, equivalent to the interference that goes on here, you delete the evidence, and the interference pattern comes back again. It's just... Yes?
You dismissed quantum mechanics from for our everyday life.
Yes.
Because you said it only affects the very small. But the border between what is very small and what is large is a bit fuzzy, and recently I believe they pushed it experimentally to a very large molecule now, a buckyball. And there's nothing that says you can't push it any further. So what have you got to say about that?
The boundary between the quantum and the classical world is fuzzy, you're right. The experiment you referred to was carried out in Vienna by a chap called Anton Zeilinger. And they were doing exactly this experiment. So I used atoms. Very often in textbooks they say electrons or photons, individual particles of light. They've done, even by the 1990s, they did it with atoms, and the atoms got bigger, and they started using carbon and sodium atoms. And then finally, you're right, they did it with carbon C60 molecules. The buckyball is a molecule made up of 60 carbon atoms, which, you're right, starts to get quite big. They had the ambition to repeat the two experiment with, I think they were going to do it with enzymes or something. They were going to do it with much more complicated viruses. Now, I know they're going to do it with very complicated molecules. They haven't done that yet. But the point is, the bigger you get, the harder it is to maintain the quantum weirdness. The quantum coherence leaks away. There's what's called decoherence takes place very, very quickly. You can stave it off for as long as you can to maintain the quantum window. So you're right, the boundary is very fuzzy. But when you get to trillions and trillions of atoms, the coherence time is so small that it doesn't have a bearing on the macroscopic time scale at all. So I think yes, you're right. It's a gradual thing, but the quantum world is so far removed from the world of trillions of atoms that you can never maintain that coherence at the macro level. Yes?
Isn't it true that the search for a unified theory is actually, in part, is to try and find that connection, and therefore link the gravitational world with the infinite world?
Yes, there are different ways of explaining what a unified theory does. Well, the theories of everything. I think technically a grand unified theory is one that unites three of the four forces of nature. The three forces that I've described by quantum mechanics. That's the electromagnetic force, and the strong and weak nuclear forces. And they've already connected the electromagnetic and the weak force. There's something called the electro-weak force. And they want to connect the strong nuclear force. There's four forces of nature. Don't know about the technical detail. And they're trying to link those three together in a grand unified theory. But a theory of everything, something like superstring theory, the hope, the ambition there, and it hasn't been achieved, is to link the force of gravity, the fourth force, with the quantum forces. Whether that brings together the large and the small is a different matter. I think the hope there is that they will be able to describe the force of gravity in terms of particles, in the same way that we describe the other forces in terms of particles. Gravity, our best theory of gravity is Einstein's theory of relativity, it's general theory of relativity. And that isn't in terms of particles, that's in terms of shapes, geometry of space-time. So many physicists believe it's a futile search, that we'll never get a theory of quantum gravity. That it's just, it's a waste of time because the two won't mesh. But other physicists say, look, that there will be regions in the universe where you have to apply Einstein's theory and quantum mechanics. So you better darn well have a theory that makes logical sense of the two together, such as the singularity in the middle of a black hole, or the Big Bang, or something like that. But that's all speculation, and the theory of everything searchers tend to be very highly abstract mathematical thinkers, because it's very difficult to find experiments that will prove some of their ideas. So they come up with an idea, and 6 months later they come up with a different, completely, oh no, good enough on that one. The problem is they're very, very clever people. There's a guy in America called Ed Whitten, who's regarded by many as the smartest human on the planet. And he thinks superstring theory is right. So you sort of think, well, he's probably clever. Maybe I'm wrong and he's right. Gentleman back, yeah, and then you.
I'm still not entirely convinced that you can apply causal determinism elegantly to consciousness in the same way that you can to inanimate objects, because if I go away from this lecture and my behavior changes because my view of free will has been changed, it doesn't really make sense to explain that change in behavior in terms of the transference of, say, sound energy in this lecture hall. You have to view my change of behavior in terms of ideas and the fact that I've acquired a different idea, which you can't. I don't think it would be absurd to try to explain it in terms of energy and particles.
Why? If your consciousness really is, those who advocate what's called strong AI, strong artificial intelligence, will say our consciousness is just software running in the brain. It's programs running in a very sophisticated, parallel processing organic computer. And so whatever sensory experiences you have, listening to a lecture, causing certain programs to run, causing certain new conclusions to take place inside your head, it can, and again, I'm arguing from one perspective. I'm not saying you're wrong and I'm right. I'm saying I support the advocates of strong AI. I see no reason why a computer couldn't one day be built that would be sentient, that would be conscious. That our conscious thoughts and ideas and emotions, love, anger, hatred, happiness, is all still software in the brain. So what you feel will affect your conscious decisions, I still think that could be done, described within the physical world.
But explaining it causally, I just can't help but feel like it's a description rather than an explanation, and it's kind of confusing the two by mixing the two different levels. So you can explain my behaviour by looking at the realm of ideas, and you can describe the transference of sound energy, but to try and explain the change in behaviour, if this makes sense, through a description of the sound energy is kind of like, I don't know, that's where I kind of stop.
But I think that's simply due to the sheer and utter complexity of human thoughts and ideas. If you were a very simple robot taking very simple instructions that you hear words that you can interpret and cause you to follow certain options or actions, then that's all, you'd presumably be happy that there's no reason why that wouldn't work. It's the fact that you're so complex, the fact that your ideas and creativity and happiness, and how can that just be a program? But for me, it's a level of complexity rather than something. It's the mind-body problem, I guess. It's another way of explaining that. But yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting. I say there are plenty of smarter philosophers than me who would argue on your side. Yes.
Yeah. If you said if you try and kind of explain quantum mechanics, you would just do a nodding your head and going, okay, well, shut up and do the math.
Yeah.
Do you feel that theoretical physics should be classified as science if it cannot technically be proven? Then should it be science or should we see it as something completely different?
That's a very good point. I think quantum mechanics is a scientific theory because it makes predictions, and those predictions can be tested. The mathematical framework for quantum mechanics is perfectly valid and powerful and accurate and testable and reproducible. Where quantum mechanics seems to have got away with it for all these years is it's the only theory in science that I'm aware of that doesn't have a defined interpretation. You know, when Einstein came up with special relativity, most of the maths had been sorted out anyway. There were others, Henrik Lorentz and Poincaré and others who'd sorted out the maths, but they didn't quite understand what the equations were telling them about reality. Einstein comes along and says, oh, it's because the light travels at constant speed for all observers and your equation is correct, but this is how you define it, there's no ether. He gave an interpretation and he's credited with relativity. Quantum mechanics has half a dozen different interpretations. We can say this is what happens if you do the experiment. Here's the maths, this is what quantum mechanics predicts will happen, correct? But there's half a dozen interpretations. So it's still a scientific theory, but it seems to be one that has this embarrassment of interpretations. We don't know. There are some physicists who say, don't worry about it, you don't need, shut up and count, you don't need an interpretation. Others who say, it's clearly wrong and there's something missing. Others who say one of the interpretations is right, we don't know which one it is. My personal view is there has to be a unique interpretation. Nature must be doing things in a particular way. If we've got an embarrassment of interpretations for our theory, then that's our problem. We need to find an experimental way to discriminate between them, and we haven't found one yet.
But surely, if you're going to say that it has a certain meaning, you just haven't found it, then it's not random anymore. So doesn't that change your view on whether you are completely sort of, if there is free will?
No, it's still random. It's still indeterminate. I think the indeterminacy of quantum mechanics, the randomness, the fuzziness, is separate from the fact that we don't have a unique interpretation. We need an interpretation that tells us how it behaves in this random way. Whatever interpretation, if there is a correct one, it will agree that there's indeterminacy and randomness. As far as I'm concerned, that indeterminacy and randomness is there to stay, regardless of whether we think there are parallel universes, or the signalings forwards and backwards in time, or things instantaneously interconnecting the whole universe, which is another interpretation I've been talking about in Brownian mechanics, which I happen to quite like personally, but I don't know if it's the correct one or not. But I think none of them will get away, will remove quantum weirdness. That quantum weirdness, the indeterminacy, the fuzziness, will always be there somewhere. It's like laying a carpet and then realizing you've laid it over the cat. You can't There'll be a bump somewhere. You can move the bump around the room. But, you know, that's the quantum weirdness. That's another my version of showing the hat just made. Time for one more question? Yeah, one more. Okay, right, sorry. Yes.
A quick question about how we speak about the question of free will.
Yes.
Do you find that in giving this talk and having conversations about free will, when you use the word free will is really an illusion, but that people stop listening at that point? Because it seems to me it concedes the point that whatever you say, what's really going on is a level of description of particles, etc. But only from the perspective that nobody in the universe can ever have. That the human perspective, and even however big that intelligence is,
Yes.
can't see it, can't see the future, or
Right.
have the perspective of free will from that
Well,
point of view.
But that's what I would agree with. That if we can't, nowhere within our universe are we able to predict the future. We'll never be able to predict the future. Then that's as good as giving us our free will back. But you know, what you say. But in fact, if you get right, well, but I mean, it's an important point. The future is predetermined. It is fixed. It's just not knowable to us. Now, you can take your pick whether you think that means we have free will or not. You presumably would say we do have free will, because since it's in practice we can't know it anyway, what's the difference? I would agree with you. But there are many philosophers who would say, just because we think we have free will doesn't mean we really do. We don't, you know, give it up. And so I guess it's almost a matter
of the words of what we really have, and using words like illusion that people immediately jump on.
yes, that's a good point. That's a good point. But you know, that's what can you do? Yeah, you have no freedom.
Now we've got to get Jim. It's got to get all the way back to.
I do apologise. I think there are other questions that I haven't come to.
So, what else should we do? Don't forget to put your tick in this box. Don't forget to stick something in the donation box. But in particular, don't forget to have a drink. And if you haven't found food for thought in this talk, then you've got a serious problem.